Right now, beneath your feet there are stories, not written in books, not carved in stone. Stories buried so deep that we've forgotten they even exist. Under the streets of London there are forests where ancient humans once hunted. Beneath the North Sea there are valleys and rivers where children played 15,000 years ago. In caves across Europe and Asia, there are paintings created by artists whose names we'll never know, whose languages have vanished, whose entire worlds have been swallowed by time. We think we know the story of humanity. School taught us about ancient Egypt, about Rome, about the first cities in Mesopotamia. We learned that civilization began around 5,000 years ago, that before that humans were just primitive hunter-gatherers wandering around without much going on. But here's the thing. Modern humans, people biologically identical to you and me, have existed for at least 300,000 years. Some evidence suggests even longer. That means for roughly 295,000 of those years, humans were doing something. Living, thriving, creating, inventing, building entire worlds that have completely disappeared from human memory. Think about that for a second. 295,000 years. Entire ice ages came and went. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Coastlines shifted. Islands appeared and vanished. Forests turned to deserts and back to forests. And through all of it, humans were there. Not just surviving, but developing cultures, technologies, beliefs and ways of life that lasted longer than all of recorded history combined. These are the lost chapters, the forgotten worlds, and we're only just beginning to rediscover them. See? Here's what nobody tells you about archaeology and ancient history. We're not looking at the full picture. We're not even looking at half the picture. We're looking at fragments. Tiny scattered pieces of a story so vast and so old that most of it has simply vanished. Every coastline where ancient humans lived for thousands of years. Underwater now, every wooden tool, every basket, every rope, every piece of clothing, rotted away millennia ago. Every camp they made, every path they walked, every place they gathered, erased by time, buried under sediment, or paved over by modern cities. What we have left are the accidents of preservation. A cave that happened to stay dry. A body that happened to fall into a peat bog. Stone tools that are literally the only things tough enough to survive hundreds of thousands of years. We're trying to understand the full richness of ancient human life by looking at the equivalent of a handful of random pages from 1,000,000 burned books. And yet, even from these fragments, incredible stories are emerging. Stories that change everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe hit subscribe and do me a favour. Drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing Berlin at breakfast, Sydney at sunset, Chicago at midnight, all experiencing the same journey through deep time together. Now let's talk about what we're going to explore, because the forgotten worlds of early humanity are more fascinating than most people ever imagine. We're going to walk through Doggerland, a massive landscape that connected Britain to mainland Europe, where thousands of people lived in what's now the floor of the North Sea. We're going to meet the first artists, people who ventured deep into pitch-black caves to create paintings so beautiful and sophisticated that when they were first discovered, scientists refused to believe ancient humans could have made them. We'll visit Göbekli Tepe, a temple complex in Turkey that's 11,600 years old. It was built by people we're told hadn't even invented agriculture yet. People who supposedly didn't have the organization or resources to create massive stone monuments. Except they did, and it changes everything. We're going to encounter ghost peoples, entire species of humans like the Denisovans that we only discovered in the last 15 years. Species we don't have skeletons for, that we know existed purely from fragments of DNA preserved in the genes of people alive today. Species that lived alongside our ancestors, that interbred with them, that shaped our evolution in ways we're only beginning to understand. We'll follow the first seafarers, people who built boats and navigated open ocean over 50,000 years ago, people who colonized islands and continents, who created trade networks spanning thousands of miles, who mastered technologies that most of us couldn't replicate today even if we tried, and will walk through lost cities, civilizations that thrive for centuries or even millennia before being reclaimed by jungle, buried by sand, or simply abandoned and forgotten until modern archaeology stumbled across them by accident. These aren't myths, these aren't legends, these are real places, real people, real chapters of human history that got lost in the vast gulf of time between their world and ours. So get comfortable, let your mind relax. We're about to take a journey backward, deep into the forgotten dawn of humanity, to worlds that existed long before recorded history, before writing, before cities, before everything we think of as civilization, to a time when humans were rarer, when the world was wilder, when every generation carried knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of years, when survival meant knowing your landscape so intimately that you could read stories in animal tracks, predict weather from the behavior of birds, and navigate by stars across trackless wilderness. Let's begin with a world that doesn't exist anymore, a world that drowned. Imagine standing on the cliffs of Dover, looking across the English Channel toward France. 23 miles of grey water separate two continents. But what if I told you that 20,000 years ago you could have walked that distance? No boats, no bridges, just solid ground stretching from Britain to Belgium, from Scotland to Scandinavia. You wouldn't have been alone on that walk either. You'd have passed through forests of birch and pine, crossed rivers teeming with salmon, maybe stopped to hunt red deer in meadows that today sit 120 metres beneath the North Sea. You'd have been walking through Doggerland, a lost world larger than many modern countries, home to thriving communities of hunter-gatherers who had no idea their entire homeland was living on borrowed time. This isn't mythology. This isn't speculation. This is documented scientific fact. During the last ice age, so much of Earth's water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped dramatically. The geography of the entire planet was different. Land bridges appeared where today we see open ocean. Islands became mountains. Coastlines extended hundreds of miles beyond their current positions, and humans lived on all of it. Thousands of years of human history played out on landscapes that are now completely submerged, their stories locked beneath the waves, waiting to be discovered. Let's start with Doggerland because it's the best documented of these drowned worlds, and because its story is absolutely haunting. Picture this. 18,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum, Britain isn't an island. It's the northwestern peninsula of a massive landmass that encompasses what we now call the British Isles, and extends east across hundreds of miles of what's currently the North Sea. To the south, it connects to the European continent. To the north, it reaches towards Scandinavia. This land, this lost country that archaeologists now call Doggerland, isn't some frozen wasteland. As the climate begins to warm around 15,000 years ago, it becomes one of the richest environments in all of Europe. The southern portions are covered in mixed deciduous forests, oak and hazel and lime, creating dense woodlands perfect for hunting. Further north, vast wetlands develop, fed by rivers draining the melting glaciers. These wetlands are ecological gold mines, absolutely teeming with life. The rivers are full of pike, perch and salmon running upstream to spawn. The wetlands attract massive flocks of migratory birds, geese and ducks and waders, so many that the sky would darken when they took flight. In the forests, red deer, roe deer, wild boar and aurochs, those massive wild cattle that would eventually be domesticated, roam in huge numbers. Along the coast, seals haul out on beaches, and fish schools so thick you could practically walk on them move through the shallow waters. For Mesolithic humans, people living in the transition period between the Paleolithic and Neolithic, this is paradise. Archaeological evidence suggests Doggerland wasn't just occasionally visited. It was permanently inhabited by sophisticated hunter-gatherer communities who understood exactly how to exploit this landscape. They weren't living in one big settlement. That would have been stupid, putting all your eggs in one basket. Instead, they practiced what anthropologists call seasonal mobility. Small groups, maybe extended families of 20 to 30 people, moved through established territories following the rhythms of nature. Spring and summer near the coasts, taking advantage of seal pupping seasons and massive fish runs. Autumn in the forests, hunting deer and gathering hazelnuts and other wild foods. Winter in more sheltered locations, probably near rivers where they could ice fish and trap waterfowl. These people weren't primitive in any sense we'd recognise. They had sophisticated tool technologies, carefully crafted microliths, tiny stone blades hafted together to make composite tools like arrows and fishing spears. They had boats, probably dugout canoes that let them exploit river systems and cross channels. They had elaborate fish traps and weirs built from wooden stakes driven into river bottoms, some of which have been found preserved in underwater archaeological sites. Most importantly, they had knowledge, generations of accumulated understanding about their environment, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, where animals would be at different times of year, how to predict weather patterns, when rivers would flood. This knowledge wasn't written down, obviously, but it was passed from parents to children, maintained and refined over thousands of years. And we know all this because Doggerland keeps giving up its secrets. In 1931, a fishing trawler working the North Sea pulled up something strange in its nets, a lump of peat which was unusual but not unprecedented. The seabed is full of ancient peat deposits, but embedded in this particular lump was a worked flint point, clearly human-made, from a time when the North Sea was dry land. That was just the beginning. Over the following decades, fishermen have accidentally dredged up thousands of artifacts from Doggerland. Bone harpoons designed for spearing fish, antler mattocks used for digging, worked flint tools of every description. In 2013, a trawler pulled up a fragment of a Neanderthal skull, proving that the area had been inhabited not just by modern humans, but by multiple human species over hundreds of thousands of years. Each artifact is a whisper from a drowned world, a message in a bottle from people who had no idea their entire homeland would one day disappear beneath the waves. Because that's exactly what happened. Starting around 18,000 years ago, the glaciers began melting. Slowly at first, barely perceptible year to year, but relentlessly. Every summer a little more ice melted. Every year the sea level rose fractionally. Over centuries and millennia those fractions added up. The people living in Doggerland would have noticed, of course. Coastal settlements that had been used for generations suddenly getting flooded during storms. Islands appearing where there had been hills, rivers changing course as their lower reaches were inundated. But it was slow enough that adaptation seemed possible. You move your settlement a little further inland. You adjust your seasonal territories. You keep going. But around 8,200 years ago, something catastrophic happened. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, triggered by an earthquake, sent a tsunami roaring across what remained of Doggerland. The Storegga Slide, as geologists call it, displaced an estimated 3,500 cubic kilometres of seafloor sediment. The resulting tsunami was probably 20 metres high when it hit the coast, drowning entire communities in minutes. After Storegga, what little remained of Doggerland was reduced to scattered islands. Within another 1,000 years, even those were gone. By 6,500 years ago, Britain was fully separated from the continent, and an entire country, with its own ecology, its own history, its own human populations, had completely vanished beneath the North Sea. But Doggerland was just one drowned world among many. On the opposite side of Eurasia, another land bridge was disappearing. Beringia, the landmass connecting Asia to North America, wasn't just a narrow corridor. At its maximum extent, it was over 1,000 miles wide, a vast cold grassland, the mammoth steppe, as researchers call it, home to herds of woolly mammoths, steppe bison, horses, and the human hunters who followed them. When the first people crossed from Asia into the Americas, they weren't making some desperate journey across a frozen wasteland. They were following game animals through familiar territory, probably not even realizing they were moving between continents. Some groups settled in Beringia itself, living there for thousands of years before sea levels rose and divided them, cutting off America from Asia and creating two separate populations that would develop independently for millennia. In Southeast Asia, an even larger landmass was drowning. The Sunda Shelf, connecting modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of Thailand and Vietnam into a single continent, was one of the most productive environments on Earth. Tropical forests, rivers and coastlines supporting human populations that had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. As sea levels rose, this continuous landmass fragmented into thousands of islands. Populations that had been in regular contact were suddenly isolated. The Sunda Shelf didn't just create Southeast Asia's modern geography. It created conditions that drove rapid cultural evolution. Island populations developed their own languages, their own technologies, their own cultural traditions. The incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of modern Southeast Asia is directly traceable to the drowning of Sunda. Further west, the Persian Gulf was completely dry during the Ice Age. What's now underwater was a river valley, the combined Tigris and Euphrates flowing through a broad plain before emptying into the Indian Ocean hundreds of miles south of where the Gulf ends today. Archaeological evidence suggests this was an incredibly rich environment, an oasis in an otherwise arid region. Some researchers think this Gulf oasis, as it's called, might have been one of the cradles of human civilization, that the first experiments with agriculture, the first permanent settlements, the first steps toward urbanization, might have happened in a landscape that's now beneath 100 meters of seawater. We'll never know for certain, unless we can excavate underwater, but the tantalizing hints keep accumulating, and that's the thing. We're only just beginning to explore these drowned worlds properly. For most of human history, underwater archaeology was essentially impossible. You can't dig through water with a shovel. You can't see ancient landscapes through murky seas. The drowned worlds kept their secrets. But technology is changing everything. Multi-beam sonar can now map seafloors in extraordinary detail, revealing ancient river valleys, coastlines, and even human structures. Underwater robots can reach depths and explore environments that would kill human divers. Ground-penetrating radar adapted for underwater use can detect buried artifacts without excavation. The discoveries coming from these new technologies are stunning. Off the coast of Israel, underwater archaeologists have found a Neolithic village, complete with stone structures and tools, now sitting 12 meters beneath the Mediterranean. In the Baltic Sea, researchers have discovered ancient fish traps and wooden structures dating back 9,000 years. Off the coast of Denmark, they've mapped entire submerged landscapes, including what appear to be hunting camps and seasonal settlements. Each discovery rewrites a small piece of human history, and we've barely started looking. The continental shelves of every continent hide drowned landscapes that were once home to human populations. How many villages are buried beneath the Persian Gulf? How many campsites lie under the South China Sea? How many ritual sites? How many burial grounds? How many centers of ancient innovation are locked beneath waters we've never properly explored? Conservative estimates suggest that at least 20 million square kilometers of land that was above water during the last ice age is now submerged. That's an area larger than Russia, potentially containing thousands of years of human history from a critical period when our ancestors were making the transition from pure hunter-gatherers to sedentary societies. Think about what that means. Entire chapters of human prehistory are, literally, underwater. the ancestors of millions of people alive today. Europeans, Asians, Americans, Australians, lived on lands we can no longer walk on. Their homes, their art, their innovations, their stories, all drowned when the ice melted. We carry their genetic legacy. Every person of European descent has ancestors who lived in Doggerland. Every Native American has ancestors who crossed through Beringia. Every Southeast Asian has ancestors who walk the continuous landmass of Sunda. But we've lost their stories, lost the details of how they lived and what they achieved. Unless we can recover them from beneath the waves, the drowned worlds are still there, waiting, preserved by the very water that swallowed them, protected from the erosion and destruction that destroys land-based sites. They're time capsules, holding secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of human prehistory. And slowly, piece by piece, artifact by artifact, we're beginning to read those secrets. The drowned worlds are starting to speak again. The question is, are we ready to listen? Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine opening them in absolute darkness. Not the darkness of your bedroom at night, but the kind of darkness that exists deep underground, where no light has ever penetrated, where the absence of sight is so complete it feels physical. You're holding a primitive torch, animal fat burning in a stone lamp, and the flickering light barely pushes back the void. Your footsteps echo on damp limestone. The air smells of earth and time. And then you turn a corner and the torchlight catches something on the wall. A horse. Not just any drawing of a horse, but a creature so perfectly rendered, so full of movement and life, that for a moment you forget you're looking at something painted 36,000 years ago. The artist caught the way horses actually move, the tension in their muscles, the alertness in their eyes. This isn't primitive art. This is mastery. Welcome to Chauvet Cave in southern France, a gallery sealed by a rockfall 29,000 years ago and preserved perfectly until its discovery in 1994. When the first researchers entered, they found more than 400 paintings covering the walls. Lions, mammoths, rhinoceroses, bears. Not crude stick figures, but sophisticated artworks that use shading, perspective, and the natural contours of the cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. Some paintings show animals in motion, legs positioned at different angles to suggest running. Others use multiple layers, painting one animal partially behind another to create depth. These weren't accidental discoveries. These were deliberate artistic choices made by people who understood visual representation as well as any modern artist. But here's what makes Chauvet truly extraordinary. The oldest paintings date to around 36,000 years ago. This means we're looking at some of the very first art ever created by modern humans, and it's not primitive. There's no learning curve visible in these caves, no awkward early attempts that gradually improve over time. The oldest paintings are often the most sophisticated. It's as if art appeared fully formed, erupting into human consciousness with complete mastery of technique and composition. This pattern repeats across Europe. In Lascaux Cave, discovered by teenagers in 1940, you find what's been called the Sistine Chapel of prehistory. Over 600 paintings and 1,400 engravings created around 17,000 years ago. The famous Hall of Bulls features massive aurochs, extinct cattle that once roamed Ice Age Europe, painted larger than life and arranged in what seems like deliberate choreography. In Altamira Cave in Spain, discovered in 1879, the ceiling of one chamber is covered with bison painted in rich ochre reds and charcoal blacks. The artists used the natural bulges in the rock to make the animals appear three-dimensional. When you lie on your back and look up at them by flickering torchlight, they seem to move, to breathe, to watch you with ancient eyes. But why? That's the question that has haunted researchers for over a century. Why would people spend hours, sometimes days, in the cold darkness of deep caves creating these images? The caves weren't living spaces. Most show no evidence of habitation, no hearths, no refuse piles, no signs that people spent extended time there. They went into these places specifically to make art, sometimes crawling through narrow passages or descending into dangerous underground chambers. Some paintings are located in places so remote and difficult to access that reaching them requires climbing or squeezing through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. This wasn't casual decoration. This was something important enough to risk death in the darkness for. The earliest theory was sympathetic magic, the idea that painting an animal gave you power over it, that creating images of prey would ensure successful hunts. This seems logical until you look at what's actually painted. Many cave paintings feature animals that weren't regularly hunted. The horses, aurochs, and deer that appear in Ice Age trash heaps. Those aren't always the animals on the cave walls. Instead, you find carnivores, dangerous predators like cave lions, bears, and hyenas, animals that humans would have avoided, not hunted. If the paintings were hunting magic, why paint things you didn't want to hunt? Some researchers have proposed that the caves were sacred spaces, prehistoric temples where shamans went to commune with the spirit world. This theory gained support when anthropologists noticed similarities between cave art and the practices of modern hunter-gatherer groups. Among the San people of southern Africa, for instance, shamans create rock art after entering trance states, painting the visions they see during spiritual journeys. Could European cave art represent something similar? Journeys into the underworld documented on stone? The theory of entoptic phenomena adds another layer to this mystery. Entoptic phenomena are visual patterns that the human nervous system generates internally, things you see when your eyes are closed or when you are in altered states of consciousness. They include geometric shapes like grids, zigzags, spirals, and dots. And here's the fascinating thing. These exact patterns appear in cave art across multiple continents, not just in Europe, but in Africa, Australia, the Americas. Everywhere humans made cave art, you find the same abstract symbols, dots arranged in patterns, lines and grids, nested curves, hand stencils created by blowing pigment over hands pressed against the wall. In Pecmel Cave in France, there's a painting from around 25,000 years ago that shows spotted horses surrounded by dozens of handprints and abstract dots. The composition is bizarre, almost hallucinatory. In El Castillo Cave in Spain, researchers dated some hand stencils to over 40,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known paintings anywhere. But why hands? What did they mean? One theory is that they represent transformation, the moment when the shaman's hand passes through the cave wall into the spirit realm. Another suggestion is simpler but equally profound. They're signatures, ways of saying, I was here, I existed. Across 30,000 years, that gesture still resonates. We still make handprints. Children still press their palms into paint or clay, announcing their presence to the world. Then came a discovery that shattered many assumptions about cave art. In 2018, researchers announced they had dated paintings in 3 Spanish caves to over 64,000 years ago. That's 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe, which means the artists weren't Homo sapiens, they were Neanderthals. The paintings are simple, geometric shapes and hand stencils, but they're deliberate, meaningful, created with the same pigments and techniques that later artists would use. Neanderthals, our evolutionary cousins, were painting in caves tens of thousands of years before we arrived. They were creating symbols, engaging in abstract thought, doing something that we thought made us uniquely human. This discovery forces us to reconsider everything. If Neanderthals created art, then symbolic thinking didn't emerge with our species. It goes back further, probably to the common ancestor we shared with Neanderthals somewhere around 500,000 years ago. Maybe even earlier. Maybe the urge to create, to represent the world symbolically, to communicate across time through images, maybe that's older than humanity itself. Maybe it's written into something deeper than our species, something fundamental to what it means to be a conscious being, looking at the world and wanting to respond to it. And then there are the children. In several caves, researchers have found footprints preserved in the soft clay floors. Not adult footprints, but the tracks of children as young as 2 or 3 years old. In Yocave in France, there's a trail of children's footprints leading deep into the mountain, almost a kilometre from the entrance. These children, accompanied by adults based on other tracks, walk through absolute darkness, holding torches, venturing into the underworld. Why? Were they being initiated into something? Learning sacred knowledge? Or were entire families making these journeys together, treating the caves as community spaces where children and adults both participated in whatever rituals or experiences happened there? In Chauvet Cave, researchers found a footprint from a child around 8 years old. Next to it, the skull of a cave bear, carefully placed on a rock. Was this an altar? An offering? A teaching moment where an adult showed a child something important about their relationship with the animal world? We'll never know, but the image haunts the imagination. A child standing in torchlight, looking at the skull of a massive predator, surrounded by painted animals that seem to move in the flickering shadows. What did that child feel? Wonder? Fear? Connection to something beyond everyday experience? The deeper you go into these caves, both literally and intellectually, the more mysterious they become. Some chambers show evidence of acoustic experimentation. Paintings cluster in areas where sound resonates, where clapping or singing produces echoes and reverberations. Did the painters choose these spots because sound was important to the ritual? Were they creating multimedia experiences, combining visual art with music or chanting? In Lascaux, there's evidence of what might be the earliest musical instruments, bone flutes that could produce complex melodies. Imagine standing in a painted chamber surrounded by animals rendered in ochre and charcoal, while someone plays a haunting melody on a bone flute, the sound echoing off the walls, the torchlight making the painted creatures seem to breathe. That's not just art, that's a fully realized aesthetic experience, sophisticated and intentional. And they didn't just paint animals. In some caves, you find what researchers call therianthropes, hybrid creatures that are part human, part animal. In Chauvet, there's a figure that might be a person with a bison's head. In Lascaux, the famous scene in the shaft shows a stick-figure man with a bird's head lying before a wounded bison. What does this mean? Is it a hunting accident? A shamanic transformation? A mythological story? The bird on a stick next to the figure might be a staff or a totem, or it might be something else entirely. The scene has been analysed for decades, and nobody agrees on its meaning. That's perhaps the most profound mystery of cave art. We can see it. We can analyse the techniques, date the pigments, map the locations. But we cannot truly understand what these images meant to the people who created them. Their symbolic language is lost to us. We're looking at messages written in a code we can only partially decipher. These artists were trying to communicate something important enough to venture into deadly darkness for, something that required the best techniques they could develop, something they wanted preserved for eternity on stone. And we, their distant descendants, stand before their work and can only guess at what they wanted to say. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the mystery is part of the message. Maybe what these ancient artists were documenting wasn't meant to be fully understood. Maybe they were trying to capture experiences that exist beyond language, beyond rational thought. The numinous, the sacred, the overwhelming encounter with forces larger than individual human life. If that's what they were painting, then our inability to fully comprehend their work doesn't mean we've failed. It means we're feeling what they wanted us to feel. Standing in darkness before images that transcend time, overwhelmed by beauty and mystery, connected across 30,000 years to people who felt the same impulses we do. The urge to create, to communicate, to leave something behind that says we were here, we saw the world, and it moved us to respond with everything we had. That impulse connects us to our ancestors more deeply than any DNA sequence. When you create anything, write anything, paint anything, You're participating in a tradition that goes back to torchlight in caves, to pigment ground from ochre and charcoal, to hands pressed against stone walls saying, "I existed, I saw, I made this." The first artists gave us that gift, and we're still using it, still trying to capture the mysterious, still venturing into darkness hoping to bring back something beautiful that others might see and understand. Picture yourself as an archaeologist in southeastern Turkey in 1994. You're standing on a barren hillside that local shepherds call Göbekli Tepe, the belly hill. For decades, everyone assumed it was just another Bronze Age burial ground. Maybe worth a quick survey, nothing special. You start digging test trenches, expecting to find a few stone walls, some pottery fragments, the usual stuff. Instead, your shovel hits something massive, something that shouldn't be there. You brush away the dirt and reveal smooth limestone carved with intricate precision, then another stone, and another. Within days, you realize you're standing on top of something that will force archaeologists to throw out their textbooks and start over. Because what you've found isn't from the Bronze Age. It's not even from the Neolithic. It's from a time when humans supposedly lived in small nomadic bands, following herds and gathering wild plants. A time when we supposedly didn't have the social organization, the technology, or the motivation to build anything more permanent than a temporary shelter. But here it is. Massive, T-shaped pillars, some standing over 15 feet tall and weighing up to 50 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals so detailed you can count the feathers on the vultures, so lifelike you can see the musculature of the big cats. And the kicker, when you carbon date the organic material in the mortar, you get an answer that seems impossible. 11,600 years old. This temple complex, and make no mistake that's what it is, was built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. At a time when conventional archaeology said humans were still figuring out how to plant seeds and domesticate animals. Göbekli Tepe wasn't just old, it was rewriting history. Let's talk about scale, because that's where the impossibility really hits you. These aren't crude standing stones like you find at later sites. These are precisely carved megalithic pillars, shaped from limestone quarried from bedrock, transported uphill, and erected with a level of engineering sophistication that shouldn't exist in the 10th millennium BCE. The largest pillars weigh more than 50 tons. That's roughly the weight of 9 full-grown elephants. And these hunter-gatherers, because that's what they were supposed to be, somehow quarried these massive stones, moved them hundreds of feet, and stood them upright with perfect vertical alignment. Without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. Think about the logistics for a second. You need teams of people, maybe hundreds of them, working in coordinated shifts. You need ropes strong enough to handle the weight, probably made from plant fibers that required specialized knowledge to process. You need rollers or sledges to move the stones. You need ramps or scaffolding to raise them into position. You need engineers who understood leverage, weight distribution, and structural stability. And you need all of this to be organized by people who supposedly had no permanent settlements, no hierarchical social structures, no writing system to plan and coordinate such massive undertakings. It makes no sense, unless everything we thought we knew about hunter-gatherer societies was wrong. But the engineering marvel is just the beginning. When you look closely at these pillars, you see something even more extraordinary. Nearly every stone is carved with elaborate imagery. Animals, dozens of them, rendered with remarkable artistic skill. Foxes prowling across the stone surface. Snakes coiling up the pillars. Vultures with outstretched wings. Scorpions frozen mid-strike. Wild boars, gazelles, and big cats that once roamed the surrounding hills. Some pillars show spiders, others display waterfowl. There are representations of insects, reptiles, and creatures that are harder to identify. And then there are the truly mysterious images, headless human figures, abstract symbols that might represent constellations or might mean something else entirely. Geometric patterns that repeat across different enclosures, suggesting a coherent symbolic language that we've lost the ability to read. This wasn't decoration for decoration's sake. This was communication. These people were telling stories in stone, encoding information that mattered enough to spend months, maybe years, carving it into 50-ton rocks. The question is, what were they trying to say? The vultures appear again and again, often depicted with human legs in their talons or hovering over headless human bodies. In many ancient cultures, vultures were associated with death and the afterlife. Sky burial, where bodies are left exposed for carrion birds, was practiced in various parts of the ancient world. Were the people of Göbekli Tepe practicing similar rituals? Were they documenting their burial customs, or were they expressing beliefs about death and transformation? The scorpions are equally puzzling. In some ancient cosmologies, scorpions represented danger, transition, or the boundary between worlds. Their prominent placement at Göbekli Tepe suggests they held powerful symbolic meaning, but what exactly? We simply don't know. And that's what makes this place so fascinating and so frustrating. Here's what we do know about the layout. Göbekli Tepe isn't a single structure. It's a complex of at least 20 circular and oval enclosures, each one built around central pillars. The enclosures range from about 30 to 100 feet in diameter. Each one required thousands of hours of labour to construct. And here's the thing that really bends your mind. These enclosures weren't built all at once. They were constructed over a period of at least 2,000 years, from roughly 9,600 BCE to 8,000 BCE. This means multiple generations, probably dozens of them, maintained a building tradition at this site. Grandparents taught children who taught their own children how to quarry limestone, carve intricate reliefs, and continue whatever ritual or ceremonial practices made this place sacred. For 2,000 years, without cities, without agriculture, without any of the social structures that we associate with sustained monumental architecture. The implications are staggering. This wasn't a one-off project by a particularly motivated group. This was a cultural tradition that persisted across millennia, suggesting social continuity and institutional knowledge that we didn't think was possible in pre-agricultural societies. So what was Göbekli Tepe actually for? Nobody knows for certain, but theories abound. The most obvious answer is that it was a temple, a sacred gathering place for religious ceremonies. The elaborate animal carvings might represent totem animals for different clans or tribes. The circular enclosures might have hosted rituals, feasts, and ceremonies that brought together dispersed hunter-gatherer groups. Some researchers think Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site, a place so sacred that people travelled from hundreds of miles away to participate in seasonal gatherings. The sheer amount of animal bones found at the site, mostly from wild game, suggests enormous feasts. We're talking about thousands of people coming together, sharing food, celebrating, and presumably reinforcing social bonds that were essential for survival in a harsh and unpredictable world. Other archaeologists have noticed that some of the pillars seem to align with celestial events. The summer solstice sunrise, for instance, aligns with certain structures. This has led to speculation that Göbekli Tepe might have functioned as an astronomical observatory, a place where ancient peoples track the movements of stars and planets. In pre-agricultural societies, knowing when seasons would change was critical for following animal migrations and knowing when wild plants would fruit. A central location where elders could observe and record celestial patterns would have been incredibly valuable. Then there's the ancestor worship theory. Those mysterious headless human figures might represent the deceased. Some researchers think Göbekli Tepe was a massive mortuary complex, a place where the dead were venerated and where the living came to connect with their ancestors. The vultures with human remains would support this interpretation. But here's what really makes archaeologists scratch their heads. Around 8,000 BCE, after 1,600 years of continuous use and construction, somebody made a decision. They decided to bury Göbekli Tepe, not abandon it, not destroy it, bury it. Carefully, deliberately, they filled in all the enclosures with thousands of tons of dirt and rubble. They preserved the pillars perfectly, standing upright, still intact with all their carvings pristine. Then they covered the entire complex with a massive artificial hill and walked away. Why? Why would people spend generations building and maintaining a sacred site, then carefully preserve it and hide it from the world? Was there a religious transformation? Did a new belief system replace the old one, and the burial was a way of respectfully closing that chapter? Did climate change force people to abandon the region? The Younger Dryas, a period of severe cooling and drought, was ending around this time. Maybe the social networks that had sustained Göbekli Tepe collapsed when people were forced to move to more hospitable regions. Or was the burial itself a final sacred act? Some cultures believe that sacred places accumulate power over time and must eventually be put to rest. Maybe burying Göbekli Tepe was the ultimate ritual, the completion of whatever spiritual purpose the site had served. We don't know, and that mystery, that gap in our understanding, is a reminder of how much we've lost. How many stories, beliefs and traditions vanished when those final shovelfuls of dirt covered the last pillar? But what we can say with certainty is this: Göbekli Tepe has forced us to completely reconsider what pre-agricultural societies were capable of. For decades, the standard narrative went like this. Hunter-gatherers were small, mobile groups living hand-to-mouth existences. Then, around 10,000 years ago, humans invented agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. Farming led to food surpluses. Food surpluses allowed people to settle in permanent villages. Permanent villages led to population growth. Population growth led to social hierarchies. Social hierarchies led to specialized labor. And specialized labor eventually produced civilization, complete with monumental architecture, art, and organized religion. Agriculture came first, everything else followed. Göbekli Tepe flips that narrative completely. Here we have monumental architecture, sophisticated art, organized religion, and coordinated labor, all before agriculture. In fact, some researchers now think Göbekli Tepe might have caused agriculture. Think about it. You have thousands of people gathering seasonally at this sacred site. They need to be fed. Hunter-gatherers in the surrounding hills start intensively harvesting wild grains to support these massive feasts. Over time, the most productive grain patches get managed more carefully. Seeds from the best plants get scattered intentionally. Before long, you're not just harvesting wild crops, you're cultivating them. Religion didn't follow agriculture. Agriculture might have followed religion. The need to feed pilgrims gathering at sacred sites like Göbekli Tepe might have been the selective pressure that pushed humans toward farming. If that's true, and the evidence is increasingly pointing that direction, then we need to completely rethink the story of civilization. Our ancestors weren't simple hunter-gatherers who stumbled into farming and then, almost accidentally, developed complex societies. They were sophisticated people with rich spiritual lives, capable of long-term planning and massive collective action, who deliberately chose to transform their relationship with the landscape. And here's the thing that should keep you up at night. Göbekli Tepe is almost certainly not unique. It's just the first site of its kind that we've found. In the decades since its discovery, archaeologists have identified several similar sites in the same region. Karahan Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepe and others, all showing similar megalithic construction, elaborate carvings, and pre-agricultural dates. How many more are out there, still buried under artificial hills or eroded beyond recognition? How many other chapters of human history are we missing? We've been looking for the origins of civilization in all the wrong places. We've been excavating cities and farming villages, assuming that complexity began with agriculture. But the real revolution, the moment when humans started thinking and organizing in fundamentally new ways, might have happened thousands of years earlier. In stone circles we haven't found yet, in just sacred sites that were buried by their builders and forgotten by their descendants. Göbekli Tepe is a reminder that our ancestors were not primitive. They were not simple. They were humans like us, with the same cognitive capabilities, the same capacity for abstract thought, the same need to find meaning in a confusing and often terrifying world. They expressed that need in stone, and then they buried it, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered, but also with wonder. Because if hunter-gatherers in the 10th millennium BCE could build something like Göbekli Tepe, what else were they capable of? What other marvels are still waiting to be discovered, hidden beneath hills that look like natural features but are actually the carefully preserved monuments of forgotten peoples? The whispers from Göbekli Tepe are changing everything we thought we knew. And the story is just beginning. Here's something that will change how you see yourself. Until about 15 years ago, we thought human evolution was a simple story. Homo erectus led to Homo heidelbergensis, which split into Neanderthals and modern humans. 2 species, 1 extinct, 1 victorious. Clean, linear, completely wrong. The truth is so much stranger. For most of human history, we weren't alone. We shared this planet with a bewildering diversity of human species. Some we've found bones of, others we know only from whispers in our DNA, genetic echoes of people who left no fossils, no tools, no graves, just traces in the genome, proof they existed, proof they mattered. We call them ghost populations, and they're forcing us to completely reimagine what it meant to be human. The revolution began in 2008, in the most unlikely place imaginable. A cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave. Russian archaeologists had been working there for years, finding stone tools and animal bones. Nothing extraordinary. Then they found a finger bone, a single fragment of a child's pinky finger, maybe 50,000 years old. In the old days, that would have been the end of it. You can't identify a species from one finger bone. There's not enough morphological information. But these weren't the old days. This was the age of ancient DNA analysis. So they sent the bone to Svante Pääbo's lab in Germany, the same team that had just finished sequencing the Neanderthal genome. What they found shouldn't have been possible. The DNA was human, but it wasn't from any known human species. Not Neanderthal, not modern human, something else entirely. A completely unknown human lineage that nobody had predicted, nobody had suspected, revealed from a fingernail-sized piece of bone. They called them Denisovans, after the cave, and here's where the story gets wild. We've only found a handful of Denisovan fossils, that finger bone, a few teeth, some skull fragments discovered recently. That's it. We don't even know exactly what they look like. We have no complete skeletons. No clear picture of their anatomy, but we know they were massively important. Because Denisovan DNA shows up in billions of people alive today. Up to 5% of the genome in modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. Traces in East Asian populations. Genetic variants that are still doing important work in human bodies thousands of generations later. Think about that. An entire human species reduced to a few fragments of bone, yet their genes are still helping people survive today. They're not extinct. Not really. They're part of us. One of those genes is particularly remarkable. It's called EPS1, and it helps process oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes. Scientists discovered that many Tibetan people carry a version of this gene that doesn't appear in any other modern human population. It's not a mutation. It's not random variation. It's Denisovan, inherited from interbreeding events that happened maybe 50,000 years ago. This means Tibetan highlanders owe their ability to live at extreme altitudes to a human species we didn't even know existed until 15 years ago. Denisovans had adapted to high-altitude environments, developed genetic solutions to the problem of thin air, and when they encountered modern humans moving through Central Asia, they passed those genes on through interbreeding. Those genes were so advantageous that natural selection kept them, amplified them, spread them through populations moving into the Himalayas. Your ancestors lived in a world where this was possible, A world where you might meet another type of human, a person who looked different, thought differently, had different adaptations, but was still human enough to have children with. And those children might carry genetic gifts that would help their descendants survive in places their parents never imagined. But Denisovans are just the beginning. They're the ghost population we've found physical evidence for. There are others, many others. In 2012, geneticists analysing African genomes discovered something impossible. Statistical patterns that didn't make sense unless modern humans had interbred with an unknown archaic population in Africa. Not Neanderthals, they never lived in Africa. Not Denisovans, their range was in Asia. Something else. Something we have no fossils for. They called it a ghost population because it appears only in the math. Computer models show that somewhere between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, modern humans in Africa encountered and interbred with another human species. The genetic traces suggest this population had diverged from our lineage maybe 700,000 years ago. They'd been evolving separately for 750,000 years, developing their own adaptations, their own survival strategies. Then they met us. And whatever happened during those encounters, DNA was exchanged. Enough that the statistical signature remains detectable in modern African populations, particularly in West and Central Africa. But we have no idea what they looked like. No bones, no tools we can definitively attribute to them. Just the genetic whisper, proof that they existed, that they mattered, and they're not the only ghosts. In 2019, researchers found evidence of another unknown population in Denisovan DNA itself. The Denisovans had interbred with something, another archaic human that shows up in their genome but nowhere else. A ghost within a ghost. Human species we know existed only because they left traces in another human species that we also barely know. How many were there? How many types of humans shared this planet with our ancestors? Every time we develop better techniques for analysing ancient DNA, we find more. The family tree of humanity isn't a tree at all. It's a braided stream, populations splitting and merging, separating for hundreds of thousands of years, then coming back together, sharing genes like traders sharing goods. But sometimes we do find the bones, and sometimes what we find is so strange, it challenges everything we thought we understood about human evolution. In 2003, archaeologists working on the Indonesian island of Flores made a discovery that seemed like a hoax. They found skeletons of tiny humans, adults who stood maybe 3.5 feet tall, with skulls the size of grapefruits, and brains only about 1/3 the volume of modern humans. They had long arms, short legs, proportions that looked almost ape-like. But they made stone tools. They hunted. They used fire. The scientific establishment was sceptical. These had to be diseased modern humans, pathological specimens, maybe people with microcephaly or some other developmental disorder. The idea of a genuinely different human species surviving until maybe 50,000 years ago on an island in Indonesia seemed absurd. Except the evidence kept accumulating. Multiple individuals all showing the same features, stone tools dating back at least 100,000 years, evidence of hunting and butchery. These weren't diseased modern humans, they were Homo floresiensis, a separate human species probably descended from Homo erectus populations that had reached the island maybe 1,000,000 years ago and then evolved in isolation. Island dwarfism is a well-documented phenomenon. Large animals evolving on islands with limited resources tend to get smaller over generations. It had happened to elephants on Mediterranean islands, hippos in Madagascar, deer on various Pacific islands. But humans? Nobody had predicted humans could undergo that kind of evolutionary transformation. Yet there they were, the Flores, hobbits, as they inevitably got nicknamed. Living on a remote island, hunting dwarf elephants and giant rats, making stone tools, maintaining a culture for potentially hundreds of thousands of years. And they might have still been there when modern humans reached the region around 50,000 years ago. Did our ancestors meet them? Did they interact? The archaeological record doesn't tell us. The Floresiensis populations disappear from the fossil record around that time. Coincidence? Or evidence of something darker? The extinction of yet another human species when modern humans arrived? Then in 2013, another impossible discovery. In the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, spelunkers discovered a chamber filled with bones. Not just a few skeletons, at least 15 individuals, maybe more, all deliberately placed in a remote, incredibly difficult to access part of the cave system. This was clearly intentional deposition, but who they were made no sense. The species was named Homo naledi, and they were bizarre. They had tiny brains, maybe 500 cubic centimeters, about the size of an orange. That's roughly a third the size of modern human brains, similar to Australopithecus, our ancestors from 3 million years ago. Their shoulders and hips looked ancient, primitive, but their hands were eerily modern, capable of precision grip and fine manipulation. Their feet were almost indistinguishable from modern human feet, designed for long-distance walking. It was like someone had taken pieces from different stages of human evolution and assembled them into a single species. And that would have been weird enough. But then came the dating results. These weren't 2-million-year-old fossils. They were between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. They'd been alive at the same time as early Homo sapiens, at the same time as Neanderthals. But here's what really shocked the scientific community. The way the bodies were deposited deep in a nearly inaccessible cave chamber suggested deliberate burial, possibly ritual behavior, the kind of symbolic thinking that we'd always assumed required large brains, advanced cognition, sophisticated culture. Homo naledi had tiny brains and primitive anatomy, but they were apparently practicing burial rituals. They were creating meaning around death. They might have had language, culture, symbolic thought, all with brains that shouldn't have been capable of it. This challenges everything we thought we knew about the relationship between brain size and intelligence, between anatomy and behavior. Were they really that cognitively sophisticated, or are we misinterpreting the evidence? The debate continues, but one thing is clear. The world was far more populated with different types of humans than we ever imagined, and some of them might have been doing things we didn't think possible. All of these species, the ones we've found and the ones we've only glimpsed in genetic data, they tell us something profound. Human evolution wasn't a ladder, one species replacing another in a steady march toward modern humans. It was a bush, wildly branching, with multiple species existing simultaneously, sometimes in the same regions, sometimes interbreeding, sometimes competing, and the interbreeding might have saved us. Modern humans carry Neanderthal genes that affect our immune systems. Specific variants that help fight off certain viruses came directly from Neanderthals. When our ancestors left Africa around 60,000 years ago, they encountered pathogens they'd never faced before. European and Asian diseases their immune systems weren't prepared for. But Neanderthals had been living in these environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd evolved defenses. When the two species interbred, we didn't just exchange genes randomly. Natural selection favoured offspring who inherited Neanderthal immune genes, the ones already adapted to local pathogens. Within a few thousand generations, those genes had spread through the modern human population. Today, nearly everyone of non-African descent carries Neanderthal immune genes. Ancient interbreeding helped us survive diseases that might otherwise have killed us. The same thing happened with Denisovans, that altitude adaptation gene. Genetic variants affecting skin pigmentation, hair texture, fat metabolism, all inherited from species we met and interbred with. Our ancestors weren't just competing with other human species. They were incorporating their adaptations, taking the best of what other humans had evolved and making it their own. But what was it actually like when these meetings happened? Imagine you're a modern human, part of a small band moving through a mountain valley in Central Asia 50,000 years ago. You've heard stories from your parents and grandparents about other people, different people, who live in these mountains. Your group has traded with them, exchanged gifts, maybe even married into their families a few generations back. Then one day you see them. They look wrong. Not quite like you. Broader faces, different postures, skin tones you've never seen. But they're using fire. They're wearing clothes. They have tools, weapons, language. They're people. Clearly people, but also clearly different. What happens next? Do you fight, trade, talk, mate? The genetic evidence tells us all of those things happened at different times and places. Sometimes the meetings were peaceful enough for interbreeding. Sometimes they might have been violent. And sometimes, perhaps most often, the two groups might have simply avoided each other, dividing territories, staying separate. We know the outcome. One human species survived. Modern humans spread across the globe while Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and all the ghost populations disappeared. By 40,000 years ago, maybe earlier, we were alone, the last human species standing. Why? What gave us the edge? We don't really know. We weren't smarter, Neanderthals had bigger brains. We weren't stronger, they were far more robust. Maybe we were more social, better at forming large cooperative groups. Maybe we were more innovative, faster at developing new technologies. Maybe it was luck being in the right place when climate disasters hit our competitors. Or maybe, and this is the unsettling possibility, maybe we killed them. Not in wars exactly, but through the slow, grinding process of competition for resources. Every time modern humans moved into a new territory, populations of other human species declined. The correlation is undeniable, though the exact mechanism remains debated. But they're not completely gone. They're in our DNA, in our immune systems, in our adaptations to high altitudes and cold climates. They're in the genes that help Tibetans breathe thin air, the immune variants that protect Europeans from viruses, the metabolic adaptations that help Pacific Islanders process certain foods. The ghost peoples live on in us. Their extinction was also a kind of merger, their genes absorbed into ours, their adaptations becoming our inheritance. You carry them. Whoever you are, whatever your ancestry, you carry the legacy of these ancient encounters. The ghost peoples aren't just scientific curiosities, mysterious species we're slowly piecing together from fragments and statistics. They're your ancestors too. Part of what made modern humans, well, modern. And we're still discovering them. Every year brings new genetic studies, new fossil finds, new ghost populations emerging from the data. The human family tree keeps growing more complex, more tangled, more strange. How many more human species are we going to find? How many more encounters, how many more episodes of interbreeding are hiding in our genomes, waiting to be discovered? We thought we knew our origins. We thought we were the end point of a simple evolutionary story. Instead, we're learning we're the survivors of something far more complex. A world populated by multiple human species, all competing, cooperating, occasionally merging, creating a genetic legacy we're only beginning to understand. The ghosts are still speaking. We just need to keep listening. Picture yourself standing on a beach in Southeast Asia, 65,000 years ago. Your people have lived on this coastline for generations, fishing the shallows, collecting shellfish, hunting in the forests that crowd down to the water's edge. But you're looking out at something that has called to humans since the beginning, the horizon. And today, for the first time, you're going to find out what's on the other side. You can't see anything out there. No land, no distant mountains, just endless blue stretching to where the sky meets the sea. But you've watched the birds. You've seen them fly out in the morning toward that emptiness and return at dusk with bellies full of fish. Birds don't fly over nothing. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of everything you've ever known, there has to be land. So you're going. You and maybe 20 others have built something your ancestors never imagined. A raft, a boat, maybe multiple canoes lashed together for stability. You've loaded it with water, gourds, dried fish, tools, fire-making materials. Everything you'll need to start a new life if you find anything. Everything you'll need to survive if you don't. This isn't exploration. This isn't curiosity. This is desperation mixed with courage in proportions nobody will ever be able to measure. Your people need new territories, new resources. The coastline is getting crowded. Other groups are pushing in from the north. So you're betting everything on a hypothesis about bird behavior and a horizon that promises nothing. You push off. Within an hour, the land behind you has vanished. You're surrounded by water in every direction. No landmarks, no reference points, just waves, sky, and the terrifying certainty that you have absolutely no idea where you're going. Here's what makes this story almost unbelievable. They made it. Those ancient seafarers, without maps, without compasses, without any of the navigation tools we consider essential, they crossed open ocean and reached Australia by 65,000 years ago. We know this because the archaeological evidence is undeniable. Human occupation sites in northern Australia, rock shelters with stone tools and the remains of ancient campfires, dated to at least 65,000 years before present. Think about what that means. To reach Australia from Southeast Asia during the Ice Age, even when sea levels were lower and some land masses were connected, required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean. 60 miles without seeing land. 60 miles of trusting that your observations, your reasoning, your desperate hope that the birds knew something you didn't, were correct. And they didn't just do it once, they did it repeatedly, bringing enough people to establish sustainable populations. Men, women, children. Pregnant women crossing open ocean on rafts. Infants who would never remember the land their parents left behind. This wasn't a lucky accident. This was systematic, intentional colonization of new territories by people who had figured out how to navigate when navigation should have been impossible. But that was just the beginning. Over the next tens of thousands of years, humans kept pushing further into the Pacific. Not all at once, not in one great migration, but in waves, each generation pushing a little further beyond the horizon. By 40,000 years ago, they had reached New Guinea, which was connected to Australia during the Ice Age, but still required significant water crossings. By 30,000 years ago, they were island hopping through the Bismarck archipelago, moving from island to island across progressively wider stretches of ocean. By 28,000 years ago, they had reached the Solomon Islands. These weren't accidents. These were systematic expansions by people who had mastered the ocean. People who had figured out that the Pacific wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. We call this region Near Oceania, the relatively close together islands north and east of Australia. And the people who colonized them developed something unprecedented, a maritime culture. Their entire way of life revolved around the sea. They weren't land people who occasionally fished. They were ocean people who occasionally came ashore. They built sophisticated watercraft, not just rafts, but genuine sea-going vessels capable of carrying tons of cargo through rough seas. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of obsidian tools made from volcanic glass that only occurs on specific islands, sometimes hundreds of miles from where the tools are found. This tells us they weren't just island hopping randomly. They were establishing trade networks, regular routes between islands, systematic exchange of goods and people. But then something strange happened. After reaching the Solomon Islands around 28,000 years ago, the expansion stopped. For more than 25,000 years, humans went no further into the Pacific. The islands of remote Oceania, the thousands of tiny specks scattered across millions of square miles of ocean, remained empty, uninhabited, unknown. Why? We don't know for certain, but the answer probably lies in the nature of the Pacific itself. Near Oceania has relatively closely spaced islands. You can see the next island from the one you're on, or at least you can see the clouds that form over volcanic peaks, giving you a target to aim for. But remote Oceania is different. The distances between islands stretch to hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. You can sail for weeks without seeing anything but water. Without advanced navigation techniques, venturing into remote Oceania was suicide. So for 25,000 years, humans stayed in near Oceania, developing, adapting, learning. And somewhere in that vast stretch of time, they figured something out. Something that would change everything. They learned to read the ocean. Around 3,500 years ago, a new culture emerged in the Bismarck archipelago. We call them the Lapita people, named after a distinctive style of pottery they created, intricate geometric patterns stamped into clay vessels. But they were much more than potters. They were the first true navigators, the first humans who could cross the open ocean, not by luck or desperation, but by skill, by systematic understanding of how the sea works. We don't know exactly how they developed their navigation techniques. That knowledge doesn't fossilize. But we can reconstruct some of it from the practices of later Polynesian navigators who preserved the ancient knowledge through generations of oral tradition. They learned to read the stars, not just the obvious ones, the bright points of light that anyone can see, but the subtle patterns. They memorized the rising and setting points of dozens of stars throughout the year. They learned which stars passed directly over which islands, creating invisible highways in the sky that could guide them across thousands of miles of featureless ocean. But stars only help at night, and only when the sky is clear. So they learned to read the swells. The deep ocean swells that roll across the Pacific in consistent patterns, created by trade winds thousands of miles away. These swells interact with islands, bending around them, reflecting off their shores, creating interference patterns that an experienced navigator can detect from dozens of miles away. They learn to feel these patterns, to lie in the bottom of their canoes and sense the subtle changes in wave rhythm that told them an island was near, even when they couldn't see it. They learn to read clouds. Islands create their own weather, moisture rising from vegetation, forming distinctive cloud formations that are visible from far beyond the horizon. Different types of islands create different cloud patterns. Volcanic peaks create one pattern, low atolls another. They learn to distinguish them all. They learn to read birds. Certain seabirds fly out to feed during the day and return to land at dusk. By watching the direction birds fly in the late afternoon, navigators could determine the direction to the nearest land. Other birds, like terns and boobies, have limited ranges. Seeing them tells you you're within a day's sail of land, even if you can't see the land itself. They even learn to read the water. The colour of the ocean changes as you approach land, reflecting the shallow lagoons of coral atolls. The phosphorescence of certain sea creatures increases near reefs. Floating debris, coconuts and branches and seeds drift in currents that flow away from islands, creating trails that lead back to their sources. All of this knowledge, accumulated over generations, tested through trial and error, refined by success and failure. And finally, around 3,200 years ago, they were ready. The Lapita people began moving east into remote Oceania. Within just a few centuries, they had colonized Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. Thousands of miles of ocean crossed, dozens of tiny islands found and settled. All without instruments, without charts, without any of the navigation tools that European explorers would consider essential thousands of years later. But the most incredible chapter was yet to come. From their settlements in Tonga and Samoa, the descendants of the Lapita people, now becoming what we recognize as Polynesians, paused for another 1,000 years, consolidating, developing new technologies, building bigger, better vessels, double-hulled canoes that could carry dozens of people, plus livestock, plus plants for establishing gardens on new islands, pigs, chickens, dogs, taro, breadfruit, bananas, everything needed to transform an empty island into a new home. And then, around 1,500 years ago, they exploded across the Pacific in what might be the most audacious feat of exploration in human history. They settled the Marquesas, islands, then used them as a launching point for voyages that would have seemed impossible to anyone else, north to Hawaii, across more than 2,000 miles of open ocean, east to Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth, a tiny speck in the vastness of the Pacific, south to New Zealand, a journey of over 2,500 miles through waters that no human had ever sailed. Think about the courage required. Think about the calculations. You're a navigator planning a voyage to find Hawaii, an island chain you've never seen, that you only know about from legends or from birds or from subtle hints in the patterns of ocean swells that suggest land far to the north. You know the voyage will take weeks, maybe months. You know that if you miss the islands, if your calculations are off by just a few degrees, your people will sail past them into empty ocean and die of thirst before you can turn back. And you go anyway. You load up the double-hulled canoes with everything your people need. You check the stars one more time. You feel the swells, confirm the patterns you've memorized. You read the clouds, watch the birds, and then you point the bow toward empty horizon and sail. Days turn into weeks. The islands you left behind disappear. The ocean stretches endless in every direction. Children get sick. Water runs low. People start questioning whether you know what you're doing, whether the old navigation stories are really true, whether there's anything out there at all. And then, one morning, you see it. A change in the clouds, a shift in the bird patterns, the colour of the water subtly different, and finally a dark line on the horizon that resolves as you sail closer into mountains, into land, into a new world that your people will make their home. This happened not once, but dozens of times. Every inhabited island in Polynesia represents one of these voyages. One decision to sail into the unknown. One success against odds that should have been impossible. And here's something that still puzzles researchers. The sweet potato. It's a South American plant, native to Peru and Ecuador. It can't float across the ocean. It can't survive long immersion in salt water. Yet it was growing in Polynesia before European contact. The Polynesian name for it, kumara, is remarkably similar to South American words for the same plant. This raises an extraordinary possibility. Did Polynesian navigators reach South America? Did they cross 4,000 miles of ocean, find the coast of South America, acquire sweet potatoes and sail back? The genetic evidence suggests contact happened at least once, around 1200 AD. Polynesian DNA shows up in some South American populations. South American DNA shows up in some Polynesian populations. We don't know if it was Polynesian sailing east or South American sailing west. But somebody made that voyage. Somebody crossed the largest ocean on Earth and returned to tell about it. All of this at a time when European sailors still hugged coastlines, terrified of losing sight of land. The last great Polynesian migration reached New Zealand around 1300 AD. The ancestors of the Maori sailed south from central Polynesia, crossing some of the most treacherous waters in the world to reach islands they couldn't possibly have known existed. And there they stopped, not because they lost the knowledge, but because there was nowhere left to go. They had reached the edge of the habitable Pacific. Every island that could support human life had been found and settled. An ocean covering a third of the Earth's surface, explored and colonized by people in wooden canoes, using nothing but observation, memory, and courage that defies comprehension. These were the first voyagers, the people who proved that humans weren't meant to stay in one place, that every horizon was an invitation, that even an ocean thousands of miles wide wasn't a barrier but a challenge. Their descendants still sail these waters, still practice the old navigation techniques, reading stars and swells and clouds, still honouring the courage of ancestors who looked at an endless ocean and decided to find out what was on the other side. They were humanity at its most audacious, at its most confident, at its most willing to risk everything on the possibility that something better lay beyond the horizon. And they were right. Picture a temple rising from the jungle floor, stone towers wrapped in strangler figs, their roots splitting ancient foundations, corridors filled with centuries of leaf litter, carvings of gods and kings so weathered you can barely make out the faces. This isn't some fantasy movie set. This is what happens when nature reclaims human ambition. When forests swallow cities whole, and sand buries streets that once echoed with thousands of voices. We think of our world as permanent, skyscrapers and highways, cities that stretch to the horizon. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It tells us that civilizations rise, flourish and vanish. Sometimes they leave barely a trace, and the jungle, the desert, the patient work of wind and rain, they erase even the mightiest monuments given enough time. The thing is, these weren't primitive settlements. We're talking about sophisticated urban centres, places with monumental architecture, complex governments, written languages, astronomical knowledge that rivaled anything in the ancient world. And yet, within a few generations, they were gone, abandoned, left to the vines and the sand and the slow grinding wheels of geological time. Start with Angkor, not just Angkor Wat, the famous temple that shows up on every travel documentary, but the entire Khmer Empire's capital complex. At its height in the 12th century, Angkor was the largest city in the world, not the largest in Southeast Asia, not one of the largest, period. Nearly 1 million people lived in a sprawling urban landscape that covered over 1,000 square kilometres. That's bigger than modern Los Angeles. The Khmer engineers were geniuses. They built a hydraulic system that would make modern city planners weep with envy. Massive reservoirs called berets, some large enough to be mistaken for natural lakes. Intricate canal networks that distributed water across the entire city. They'd figured out how to manage monsoon flooding, store water for the dry season, and support intensive rice agriculture that fed nearly 1 million mouths. All of this in the 12th century using nothing but stone tools and human labour. And the temples. God, the temples. Angkor Wat itself took 30 years to build and required the labour of thousands of workers. It's the largest religious monument ever constructed. The stone had to be quarried from mountains 50 kilometres away and floated down rivers on rafts. The intricate bas-reliefs covering the walls tell stories from Hindu mythology, in scenes, stretching for hundreds of metres. Every surface carved with precision that suggests the sculptors spent their entire lives perfecting their craft. But something went wrong. By the early 15th century, Angkor was in decline. The population was shrinking. The maintenance systems for those elaborate waterworks were breaking down. And then, relatively quickly, the city was abandoned. Not completely, not all at once. Angkor Wat itself remained a Buddhist monastery. But the vast urban complex, the neighbourhoods and markets and lesser temples, they emptied out. Within a few generations, the jungle moved in. And when jungle reclaims a city, it doesn't mess around. Tree roots don't care about your carefully fitted stone blocks. They grow slowly, patiently, forcing their way into every crack and crevice. Over decades, they can split foundation stones weighing several tons. Strangler figs are particularly aggressive. They germinate in the canopy, send roots down the sides of structures, and eventually encase entire buildings in living wood. By the time French naturalists rediscovered Angkor in the 1860s, many structures were so thoroughly consumed by vegetation that you couldn't tell where the trees ended and the architecture began. What happened? Why would 1 million people abandon the greatest city in the world? The answer is probably complicated, but climate change played a major role. Tree ring data from the region shows a series of severe droughts in the 14th and early 15th centuries, interrupted by periods of intense flooding. That sophisticated water management system that had made Angkor possible became its weakness. During droughts, the reservoirs ran dry. During floods, the canal networks overwhelmed and damaged infrastructure. The environmental conditions that had supported the city for 600 years were shifting, and the Khmer couldn't adapt fast enough. Now jump to the other side of the world, the Maya lowlands of Central America. Between 250 and 900 CE, this region hosted, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. Dozens of city-states, each ruled by a divine king, each competing for prestige and resources. They built stepped pyramids that towered over the jungle canopy. They developed a complete writing system, one of only 5 independently invented in human history. They created a calendar more accurate than anything used in Europe at the time. They were master astronomers who could predict eclipses and planetary movements with stunning precision. And then, over the course of just a few generations, it collapsed. One by one, the great Maya cities were abandoned. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Calakmul. Places that had been regional powers for centuries went silent. Construction stopped. The dated monuments that Maya kings erected to commemorate their achievements, they just stopped appearing in the archaeological record. By 950 CE, the classic Maya civilization was over. The cities remained, but the people were gone, scattered into smaller settlements or migrated north to the Yucatan Peninsula. Walking through these ruins today is eerie. Temples emerge from the rainforest like islands from a green sea. You climb pyramid steps worn smooth by centuries of tropical rain. You stand in plazas that once hosted thousands during ceremonial events, now so quiet you can hear leaves falling. Excavations reveal houses, workshops, ball courts for the ritual Maya ball game that mix sport with human sacrifice. Evidence of a vibrant, complex society that simply stopped existing in its urban form. Why? The Maya collapse has been debated by archaeologists for decades. Multiple factors were probably involved. There's evidence of increased warfare between competing cities during the collapse period. More monuments show captive kings being humiliated and sacrificed. More defensive fortifications around urban centres. But warfare alone doesn't explain why people abandoned the cities, rather than just changing rulers. Climate played a role here too. Sediment cores from lakes in the Maya region show a series of severe droughts between 800 and 1000 CE. The worst was around 820 CE, possibly the most severe drought in the region in thousands of years. And the Maya were vulnerable. They'd built elaborate cities in a tropical environment where water management was already challenging. Most Maya cities depended on reservoirs and cisterns to store rainwater during the dry season. When the rains failed for years at a time, those systems couldn't cope. Crop failures would have led to famine. Famine would have undermined the divine king's legitimacy. Social order would have broken down rapidly. But there's another factor: environmental degradation. The Maya had been clearing forest for agriculture for centuries. Soil erosion was probably severe in many areas. Deforestation may have altered local rainfall patterns. The cities themselves might have made their environment less able to support them. They built the tools of their own collapse. Then there's the Indus Valley Civilization. Most people have never heard of it, which is wild because at its peak, around 2600 BCE, it was one of the 3 great early civilizations along with Egypt and Mesopotamia. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were its major cities, located in what's now Pakistan, and they were remarkably advanced. The urban planning is what gets me. These cities were laid out on precise grids. Houses were built with standardized bricks. There were sophisticated drainage systems running under every street, public baths, granaries, 2-story buildings with private wells and toilets that drained into municipal sewer systems. This is 4,600 years ago. Most cities in medieval Europe didn't have sanitation infrastructure this advanced. The Indus people developed a writing system that we still haven't deciphered. They created standardized weights and measures used across their entire civilization, suggesting centralized authority and extensive trade networks. They built massive citadels and public buildings, but oddly no temples or palaces that we've identified. No obvious representations of kings or divine rulers. The social organization was unlike anything else in the ancient world. And then, around 1900 BCE, it declined. Not collapsed exactly, but the cities were gradually abandoned. The population dispersed into smaller rural settlements. The writing system fell out of use. The trade networks broke down. By 1300 BCE, the urban phase of the Indus Valley civilization was over. What happened is still debated because we can't read their writing. Climate change is suspected again. The Gagahakra River, which may have been the civilization's lifeblood, appears to have dried up or changed course around this time. Without reliable water for irrigation, the agricultural surplus that supported urban life would have disappeared. Some researchers think earthquakes might have diverted rivers. Others point to evidence of decreasing monsoon rainfall. But without written records, we're piecing together the story from archaeology alone. Then there are the legendary cities. Troy, dismissed as pure myth until Heinrich Schliemann found it in Turkey in the 1870s. Multiple cities built on the same site, one atop another, spanning thousands of years. One of those layers matches the time frame of Homer's Trojan War. Whether there was actually a Greek siege over a stolen woman, we'll never know. But there was a real city, and it was destroyed by fire around 1200 BCE. Or Ur, the biblical city where Abraham supposedly was born. For centuries it was just a name in ancient texts. Then archaeologists found it in southern Iraq, a massive ziggurat rising from the desert, surrounded by the ruins of one of Mesopotamia's greatest cities. Founded around 3800 BCE, abandoned around 500 BCE when the Euphrates River shifted. Course. 2,000 years of human occupation erased by changing hydrology. And of course, Atlantis. Plato's legendary island civilization that supposedly sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. Almost certainly a philosophical allegory rather than a real place, but that hasn't stopped people from searching. Was it inspired by the Minoan civilization on Crete, devastated by the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE? Was it a distant memory of post-Ice Age flooding when rising seas drowned coastal settlements? Or was it always just a story? The search continues, though mostly by people who should know better. But here's where it gets really interesting. Modern technology is revealing that we've only scratched the surface, literally. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, uses laser pulses from aircraft to map terrain with incredible precision. It can see through forest canopy, revealing the ground beneath. And when archaeologists started using LiDAR in Central America, they found something astonishing. Beneath the Guatemalan jungle, they discovered vast urban complexes that had been invisible from ground level. Not just a few buildings, but entire cities connected by causeways, agricultural terraces covering hillsides, defensive fortifications, thousands of structures hidden under centuries of forest growth. The surveys revealed that Maya civilization was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Population estimates for the Maya lowlands at the civilization's peak have been revised upward to 10 or even 15 million people. Similar discoveries are happening worldwide. LiDAR surveys in Cambodia revealed that Angkor was even larger than previously thought, with urban sprawl extending far beyond the temple complexes. In Honduras, a mysterious lost city called the White City, or City of the Monkey God, was located using aerial surveys. How many other cities are still out there, waiting under jungle canopy or desert sand? But these discoveries raise uncomfortable questions. These weren't simple societies that collapsed because they lacked sophistication. They were complex civilizations with advanced technology, extensive trade networks, centralized governments. They built monuments that still inspire awe thousands of years later, and they failed anyway. Was it climate? Warfare? Disease? Environmental degradation from overexploitation of resources? Probably all of the above, in different combinations for different civilizations. The specifics vary, but the pattern repeats. Civilizations push their environments to the limit. They grow dependent on specific climatic conditions or resource flows. When those conditions change, when rivers shift or rainfall patterns alter, or soil fertility declines, they can't adapt fast enough Social order breaks down, cities empty, and within a few generations the jungle or desert moves in to reclaim what humans built. The lesson is sobering. These lost cities are monuments to human achievement and human vulnerability. We can build wonders, create art and architecture and knowledge systems that endure for millennia, but we exist in relationship with our environment, not separate from it. Push too hard, depend too heavily on specific conditions, fail to adapt when those conditions change, and even the greatest civilization can become just another ruin waiting to be rediscovered by future archaeologists. The jungle doesn't care about your monuments. The desert doesn't care about your legacy. Nature is patient. It waits, and given enough time, it always wins. The question for our own civilization is whether we're paying attention to the warnings written in these stones, whether we'll recognize the patterns before they repeat, or whether future explorers will one day hack their way through overgrown ruins and wonder what happened to us, just as we wonder about Angkor and the Maya and all the other cities that time forgot. 20,000 years ago, Earth was a planet we wouldn't recognize. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered Canada, buried Scandinavia, crushed the British Isles under grinding glaciers. So much water was locked up in ice that sea levels had dropped 400 feet. The Mediterranean was smaller. Indonesia and mainland Asia were connected by vast grasslands. You could walk from France to England without getting your feet wet. This was the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, and it had compressed humanity into the smallest territories we'd occupied since our species first evolved. We weren't spread across the globe yet. We were huddled in refugia, pockets of survivable land squeezed between advancing ice to the north and expanding deserts to the south. The genetic evidence for this compression is stark. When you analyse human DNA, you find signatures of what population geneticists call bottlenecks, moments when our numbers crash so dramatically that only a few thousand individuals survived. Not a few thousand in one place, that would have been suicidal, but a few thousand total, scattered across multiple refugia, each group small enough that a single disaster could wipe them out, but collectively distributed enough that some would always survive. One refugia was in southern Spain and southwestern France, where the Pyrenees created a zone with slightly milder climate. Another was along the coast of North Africa, where proximity to the Mediterranean moderated temperatures. There was a refugium in the Middle East, in the Levant, where groups clustered around permanent springs and oases. Another in East Africa, along the Great Rift Valley, where lakes and rivers still flowed, and possibly others in southern Asia that we're still discovering through genetic archaeology. These weren't large populations. We're talking groups of maybe 50 to 200 individuals, maintaining tenuous contact with neighbouring groups through trade and intermarriage, but living separately enough that they were developing distinct genetic signatures, unique combinations of alleles that marked them as survivors of specific refugia. And then the ice began to melt. Not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, over thousands of years, the glaciers started their retreat. Rivers of meltwater carved new channels through ancient landscapes. Grasslands began creeping north, following the receding ice. Animal herds that had been compressed into narrow corridors started expanding into newly opened territories, and humans, those battle-hardened descendants of bottleneck survivors, they followed. But here's what makes this different from earlier human expansions. This time, the people moving weren't just one undifferentiated population of early humans. By 20,000 years ago, modern humans had already absorbed the Neanderthals through interbreeding. We carried their genes, their cold weather adaptations, their genetic resistance to certain diseases. We'd interbred with Denisovans in Asia, picking up their high-altitude adaptations and immune system variants. We were walking genetic libraries, carrying survival strategies learned by multiple human species over hundreds of thousands of years, and we were ready to use them. The migration out of the Ice Age refugia wasn't random. It followed specific routes, pathways shaped by geography, climate, and the slowly changing environment. The genetic evidence lets us trace these routes with remarkable precision, seeing patterns in DNA that reveal exactly which populations moved where and when. The first major route was coastal. Groups living along the shores of the Red Sea and Persian Gulf began moving east, following the coastline. This is what geneticists call the Southern Route, and it was incredibly successful. These coastal migrants had access to seafood, shellfish, seabirds, resources that remained abundant even when terrestrial animals were scarce. They developed sophisticated maritime technologies, boats capable of crossing wide rivers and even short stretches of open ocean. Within just a few thousand years, descendants of these coastal migrants had reached India, Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia. The archaeological evidence shows them arriving in Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier, which means they had to cross significant stretches of open water even when sea levels were at their lowest. These weren't just opportunistic beachwalkers. These were skilled seafarers, capable of navigation, planning, and coordinated expedition organisation. The second route was northern, through the Levant and into the grasslands that would eventually become Europe and Central Asia. This northern route was harder, requiring different survival strategies. Groups taking this path needed cold weather adaptations, the ability to hunt large mammals, social structures capable of maintaining cooperation through long, brutal winters. The genetic evidence shows multiple waves of migration along this route. First came early modern humans around 45,000 years ago, moving cautiously into Neanderthal territory. These initial migrants interbred extensively with Neanderthals, creating hybrid populations that carried the best genetic adaptations of both species. Then came later waves, post-Ice Age maximum migrants who found a warming world and empty territories left behind by extinct megafauna and vanished Neanderthal populations. But the most extraordinary migration was yet to come. Somewhere around 25,000 years ago, maybe earlier, some groups began moving northeast into the harshest environments humans had ever attempted to colonize. They crossed into Siberia, into territories where winter temperatures dropped to -40, -50 degrees, where food was scarce for 8 months of the year, where a single mistake, forgetting to dry your boots properly, losing your fire-starting kit could mean death within hours. These Siberian pioneers developed technologies we can barely comprehend. They learned to build shelters from mammoth bones and hides, creating semi-permanent structures that could withstand Arctic storms. They figured out how to preserve meat through long winters, possibly by freezing it in underground ice cellars. They developed clothing sophisticated enough to keep them alive in temperatures that would kill an unprepared modern human in minutes. Layered garments made from carefully prepared animal skins, boots lined with grass for insulation, mittens and hoods that covered every inch of exposed skin. Most remarkably, they maintained these technologies across generations. This wasn't just individual innovation. This was cultural transmission, systematic teaching of complex skills from parents to children, maintained across hundreds of generations in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. And they kept moving north, following mammoth herds, tracking seasonal migrations of reindeer, slowly adapting to territories that even other humans had considered uninhabitable. Until finally, around 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, some groups reached the edge. Beringia, the vast grassland that connected Siberia to Alaska when sea levels were low. Now, traditional archaeology said the peopling of the Americas happened quickly, around 13,000 years ago when the ice sheets separating Alaska from the rest of North America finally melted, creating an ice-free corridor. Groups of mammoth hunters from Siberia crossed into Alaska, moved south through this corridor, and within just a few centuries had spread from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. They were the Clovis culture, named after distinctive spear points first found in Clovis, New Mexico. And for decades this was the accepted story. Clovis first. But the genetic evidence never quite fit. Native American populations showed too much genetic diversity, too many distinct lineages to have descended from a single migration just 13,000 years ago. There were weird genetic markers, connections to populations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific that didn't make sense if everyone had come through Siberia at the same time. And then archaeologists started finding pre-Clovis sites, places where humans had clearly been living in the Americas before the ice-free corridor opened. Monteverde in Chile, dated to 14,500 years ago. White sands in New Mexico with human footprints dated to over 23,000 years ago. Bluefish caves in Yukon with possible human tools from 24,000 years ago. These discoveries forced a complete rethinking of American prehistory. If people were in the Americas before the ice-free corridor opened, how did they get there? The answer seems to be coastal. The Kelp Highway hypothesis suggests that maritime peoples from Asia followed the Pacific coast, using boats to leapfrog along the shoreline, exploiting rich marine resources in kelp forests that provided food and shelter from storms. These coastal migrants could have reached the Americas much earlier than 13,000 years ago, possibly during the last glacial maximum itself, when sea levels were at their lowest and coastal routes were most favourable. They would have lived almost entirely on maritime resources: fish, shellfish, seals, seabirds, leaving few archaeological traces because their coastal settlements are now underwater, drowned when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The genetic evidence supports this. Ancient DNA extracted from some of the oldest skeletons in the Americas shows these early inhabitants were already genetically distinct from later Clovis populations. They represent a separate migration wave, possibly much older, that had been living in the Americas for thousands of years before Clovis hunters arrived from the north. And there might have been other waves we haven't discovered yet. Some genetic studies suggest at least 4 separate migrations into the Americas. Some researchers even argue for pre-Ice Age maximum arrivals, groups that reached the Americas 30,000 or 40,000 years ago, though this remains highly controversial. What's clear is that the peopling of the Americas wasn't a single heroic journey. It was multiple waves of migration, separated by thousands of years, each bringing different genetic lineages, different technologies, different cultural traditions. Some of these groups met and intermingled. Others remained isolated for millennia, developing in parallel until they encountered each other and their descendants during historic times. But step back and look at what this means. In less than 50,000 years, a span that's nothing in evolutionary terms, humans had spread from Africa to literally every habitable continent on Earth. We'd adapted to Arctic tundra and tropical rainforests. We'd crossed oceans and climbed mountain ranges. We'd developed technologies for every environment, from desert survival to ice fishing to maritime navigation. And all of this started from those refugia, those tiny population pockets squeezed between ice and desert during the last glacial maximum. Every human alive today descended from maybe just a few thousand individuals who survived in those refugia 20,000 years ago. If you're of European descent, your ancestors likely survived in the Franco-Iberian refugium, huddled in caves in southwestern France and northern Spain. If you're East Asian, your ancestors probably weathered the Ice Age in refugia somewhere in southern China or Southeast Asia. If you're Native American, your ancestors survived in Beringia, that Ice Age grassland that connected Asia and America. The ancient DNA studies keep revealing new connections, unexpected genetic linkages between populations we thought were completely separate. Modern Siberians carry genetic markers found in Native Americans, evidence of back migration from America to Asia after the Ice Age. Aboriginal Australians show genetic connections to populations in India and the Andaman Islands, traces of that ancient coastal migration route. Some Native American populations carry genetic variants found in Polynesian populations, suggesting contact between the Americas and Pacific Islands thousands of years before European explorers arrived. We're not separate races or fundamentally different peoples. We're all descendants of the same small groups of Ice Age survivors, all carrying the same basic genetic toolkit, just mixed and recombined in different patterns as our ancestors spread across the globe. The differences between human populations, skin colour, hair texture, facial features, they're just superficial adaptations to local environments, selected for over a few hundred generations. Underneath, we're all the same species, all children of the Ice Age exodus, and we're all evidence that humans are the most adaptable species in the history of the planet. Give us any environment, any challenge, and we'll figure out how to survive there. We'll develop the technologies, the social structures, the cultural traditions necessary to thrive. That's our evolutionary inheritance from those Ice Age survivors. Not strength or speed, but adaptability. The ability to learn, to innovate, to pass knowledge across generations. That's what the Ice Age exodus really represents. Not just a series of migrations, but proof of human resilience. Proof that we can face any challenge, survive any catastrophe, and emerge stronger on the other side. Here's what you need to understand. When most people hear Stone Age, they picture cave people banging rocks together, grunting at each other, barely scraping by. They imagine primitive brutes who are just smart enough to make fire and not much else. This image is completely, utterly, catastrophically wrong. The people we're about to discuss were inventors, engineers, chemists, and master craftspeople whose technologies were so sophisticated that modern experimenters, with all their knowledge and training, sometimes can't replicate them. These weren't primitive humans making do. These were brilliant innovators solving complex problems with limited materials, and their solutions were sometimes more elegant than anything we use today. Let's start with stone tools, because that's what we named the entire era after. But calling them stone tools is like calling a smartphone a rock with lightning inside. Technically accurate, but missing about 99% of what makes it interesting. By 300,000 years ago, human toolmakers had developed something called the Levallois technique. Here's what that means. You take a piece of stone, usually flint or obsidian, and you don't just chip away at it randomly until you get something useful. Instead, you carefully shape the entire stone into a prepared core, planning out exactly where each flake will come off. Then, with a single, precisely aimed strike, you remove a finished tool that's already the right shape and sharpness. One hit, one perfect spear point or cutting blade. This isn't banging rocks together. This is three-dimensional spatial reasoning, an understanding of stone fracture mechanics, and planning multiple steps ahead. Modern experimental archaeologists who try to learn Levallois napping typically need years of practice before they can produce decent results. Years. And these are people with instruction manuals, video tutorials, and teachers. Stone Age craftspeople had to figure it all out from scratch, then pass that knowledge down through generations using only demonstration and practice. Think about what that requires. You need teaching, learning, patience, and a society stable enough that people can spend years becoming expert toolmakers instead of desperately scraping for food every day. But the Levallois technique was just the beginning. By 70,000 years ago, stoneworkers had developed pressure flaking. This technique produces blades so thin and sharp they can slice through modern surgical tubing. The edges are smoother at the molecular level than most metal knives. Obsidian scalpels made using ancient pressure flaking techniques are actually used in some modern surgeries because they create cleaner cuts than steel, causing less tissue damage and faster healing. Let that sink in. Stone Age technology that's superior to modern medical instruments for certain applications. These blades required incredible precision. You had to understand exactly how much pressure to apply, at precisely what angle, to remove flakes sometimes thinner than paper without shattering the entire piece. One wrong move and months of work could be destroyed in an instant. The people making these tools had to develop not just technical skill, but also emotional control, patience, the ability to work in a focused state for hours at a time. This is the same mental discipline modern craftspeople spend lifetimes developing. But stone tools, no matter how sophisticated, could only take you so far. To really change the game, you needed to make things that didn't exist in nature at all. You needed to invent. Around 400,000 years ago, someone figured out that you could take a wooden spear and make it dramatically harder by heating it carefully in a fire. Not burning it, that would weaken it, but heating it just enough to drive out moisture and harden the cellulose structure, creating a point that could punch through thick animal hides. This is the first evidence of humans deliberately using chemistry to modify material properties. These weren't accidental discoveries from spears that fell in fires. The heating patterns are too controlled, too systematic. Someone was experimenting, testing, figuring out exactly how hot and how long to maximize hardness without causing brittleness. Then came adhesives. By 200,000 years ago, people were manufacturing birch bark tar, a sticky resin perfect for attaching stone points to wooden shafts. Here's the thing about birch bark tar. It doesn't occur naturally. You have to heat birch bark to specific temperatures, usually between 340 and 400 degrees Celsius, in low oxygen conditions to produce it. This means building special fires, probably in pits covered with soil, and maintaining precise temperature control for hours. This is pyrotechnology, the controlled use of fire to transform materials. It's the same basic principle that would eventually give us pottery, metalworking, and glass. Stone Age people invented it first, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before writing, before civilization as we usually understand it. And they needed those adhesives because they were building composite tools, not just a stone on a stick, but carefully designed weapons with multiple components, each serving a specific function. Stone points for penetration, wooden shafts for leverage, adhesive and cordage to bind them together, sometimes feathers for stabilization. Each component had to be made separately using different materials and techniques, then assembled into a functioning whole. This is systems thinking, engineering, the kind of complex problem solving we usually associate with much later periods of human history. But the real revolution came with projectile weapons. Sometime before 70,000 years ago, probably much earlier, someone figured out that you didn't have to get close to dangerous animals to kill them. You could make the weapon go to the animal instead. The atlatl, or spear thrower, was probably the first projectile launcher. It's basically a stick with a hook on one end that holds the back of a spear. Simple, right? Except it effectively lengthens your arm, increasing leverage and allowing you to throw a spear twice as far and with significantly more force. The physics are straightforward now that we understand them, but figuring them out from scratch required understanding concepts like leverage, trajectory, and momentum. Then came bows. Bow technology is insanely complex when you actually break it down. You need to find wood that's flexible but strong, usually from specific trees. You need cordage strong enough to withstand repeated tension without snapping. You need to understand that different types of wood have different properties, some good for the belly of the bow where it compresses, others better for the back where it's under tension. You need arrows that are straight, properly weighted, and fletched to fly true. Each arrow represents hours of careful work. The oldest definite evidence of bows comes from around 70,000 years ago, but many archaeologists think they're much older. The problem is that bows are made from organic materials that rarely survive. We might have direct evidence from 70,000 years ago, but the actual invention could easily be twice that old or more. What bows did was fundamentally change the human relationship with the environment. Suddenly you could kill animals from 50, even 100 feet away. You could hunt birds in flight. You could defend your camp from predators without risking close combat. You could hunt alone if necessary, not needing a large group for protection. This technology was so effective, so game-changing, that it spread to every human population on Earth. When people reached Australia 65,000 years ago, they brought bows. When they entered the Americas 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, they brought bows. Every single human culture that's been studied uses projectile weapons. It's universal, which tells you how important it was. But here's something most people never think about. None of these tools could exist without cordage. Twisted fibers, rope, string. the stuff we barely even notice today. Cordage might be the single most important technology humans ever invented, and it gets almost no attention because it doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record. Plant fibres and animal sinew rot away, usually within decades or centuries. So, we have very little direct evidence, but what we do have is stunning. The oldest preserved cordage fragments date to 50,000 years ago, but there's indirect evidence going back much further. Venus figurines from 25,000 years ago show detailed depictions of woven textiles. Cave paintings show images of nets and traps. Stone tools from 100,000 years ago show where patterns consistent with cutting and processing plant fibres. People were making rope, string, nets, baskets, and probably cloth for tens of thousands of years before we get direct preservation. And think about what cordage enables. You can make nets for fishing, catching fish by the hundreds instead of one at a time. You can make traps for small game, hunting while you sleep. You can tie things together, creating shelters, rafts, sleds for moving, heavy loads. You can make clothing, bags for carrying food, even binding for injurers. Cordage is the foundation for thousands of other technologies. Without it, human civilization as we know it would be impossible, and people were making incredibly sophisticated textiles. Fragments from 30,000 years ago show evidence of different weaving techniques, fine and coarse threads used together, patterns that suggest clothing designed for specific purposes. This wasn't just wrapping animal skins around yourself. This was tailoring, fashion, the beginning of using clothing as social expression and identity. Some Venus figurines show what appear to be elaborate string skirts or woven garments. People were investing time and skill in making their clothing beautiful, not just functional. That tells you they had moved beyond mere survival. They had time for art, for self-expression, for culture. Then there's heat treatment of stone, a technology so advanced that archaeologists didn't even recognize it was happening until the 1970s. Around 165,000 years ago in South Africa, people figured out that if you carefully heated certain types of stone before knapping them, the stone became easier to work and produce sharper, more consistent flakes. This required building fires that could reach specific temperatures, probably around 350 degrees Celsius, then letting the stones cool slowly to avoid thermal shock. The heated stones had to be kept at temperature for hours, sometimes buried in sand or ash to ensure even heating. This is materials science, experiments repeated and refined over generations until people understood exactly which stones could be heat-treated, at what temperatures, and for how long. The knowledge had to be transmitted from master craftspeople to apprentices, probably with terrible failures along the way as people figured out what worked. This is a technological tradition that lasted over 100,000 years, passed down through thousands of generations. But perhaps the most impressive thing about Stone Age technology isn't any single invention. It's the networks. By 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier, people were moving raw materials across enormous distances. Obsidian from specific volcanoes shows up in sites hundreds of miles away. Seashells from the coast appear in inland settlements. Red ochre, a pigment used for body decoration and possibly hide processing, was traded across entire continents. This tells us that people weren't living in isolated bands, desperately struggling for survival. They were part of vast social networks, trading goods, sharing information, maintaining relationships across distances that would take weeks or months to travel. These trade networks required complex social organization. You needed people who specialized in long-distance travel. You needed agreements about safe passage through different territories. You needed systems for determining fair exchange, probably elaborate gift-giving ceremonies that created obligations between groups. You needed ways of tracking debts and credits across years or decades. This is sophisticated economics, emerging tens of thousands of years before anyone invented writing to keep formal records. The archaeological evidence shows that high-quality tool-making stone was especially valuable. Some sites show signs of specialists, individuals who focused primarily on making tools that would then be traded for other goods. This is the beginning of occupational specialization, people doing different jobs, relying on trade to get things they couldn't make themselves. It's the foundation of economic complexity, and it was happening in the Stone Age. And then there's one more thing. These people were experimenting constantly. Every single technology we've discussed required thousands, maybe millions of failed attempts before someone figured out the right method. Someone had to be the first person to successfully make birch bark tar, probably after many previous people had tried and failed. Someone had to be the first to figure out the Levallois technique after countless hours of producing mediocre tools. Someone had to be the first to successfully heat-treat stone, probably after watching many precious pieces shatter from thermal shock. This means Stone Age people had something we usually associate with much later periods. They had an experimental mindset, a willingness to try new things, to fail, to learn from those failures and try again. They passed on not just successful techniques, but probably also knowledge about what didn't work, the accumulated wisdom of generations of trial and error. This is science, the systematic investigation of the world through experiment and observation. They were doing it 100,000 years before anyone would have called it that. So when you picture Stone Age people, don't imagine primitive brutes. Picture engineers carefully shaping stone with molecular precision. Picture chemists experimenting with temperature and materials to create adhesives. Picture weavers creating complex textiles. Picture entrepreneurs moving valuable goods across vast trade networks. Picture teachers patiently passing on complex skills to the next generation. These were your ancestors. These were people whose innovations were so successful, so fundamentally important, that we still use many of them today. Every piece of rope, every woven fabric, every projectile weapon, every carefully crafted tool traces its lineage back to Stone Age inventors who looked at the world and figured out how to make it better. They laid the foundation for everything that came after. Agriculture, cities, writing, computers, all of it builds on technologies that were perfected before recorded history even began. The forgotten inventors weren't primitive, they were brilliant, and we owe them everything, and so we return. Back from the depths of forgotten time, from drowned coastlines and hidden temples, from painted caves and vanished cities, back from the ice and the migrations, from the ghost peoples and the first voyagers, back to the present moment, wherever you are right now, listening to these words. But here's the thing. You never really left those ancient worlds, because they're still here, still present in ways most people never think about. Every time you use a needle and thread, you're using technology invented by anonymous Ice Age seamstresses whose names we'll never know. Every time you tell a story, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to those first cave painters 45,000 years ago. Every time you navigate by the stars or build something with careful planning, you're drawing on cognitive abilities refined during the genetic bottleneck, shaped by 117,000 years of desperate survival. You're literally made of the ancient world. Between 1% and 4% of your DNA, if your ancestors came from outside Africa, is Neanderthal. Another fraction might be Denisovan. The rest comes from those African survivors who endured the bottleneck and then exploded across the continents. You carry genes for processing plant toxins that helped ancient foragers survive, variants for digesting milk that emerged when the first farmers domesticated cattle, adaptations for high-altitude living, for resisting tropical diseases, for surviving in Arctic conditions. Your genome is an archaeological site, a palimpsest of survival strategies written over hundreds of thousands of years, every generation adding new layers, new solutions to the endless problem of staying alive in a dangerous world. But it's not just genetics, it's culture too. Somewhere in the deep structure of human consciousness, there are patterns that go back unimaginably far. The way we organize our societies into families and communities, the way we feel awe when we look at the stars, the way we create art and music and ritual. These things didn't emerge yesterday. They have roots that stretch back through the entire journey we've explored together. When you feel wonder at a beautiful landscape, you're feeling something the first artists felt when they painted those cave walls. When you work together with others to accomplish something difficult, you're enacting social strategies developed during the bottleneck. When you look at your children and hope for their future, you're participating in the same basic human drive that kept those 1,280 survivors going through 117,000 years of near extinction. We are all echoes of the forgotten worlds, all products of innovations and catastrophes and migrations we're only beginning to understand. And here's what makes this truly extraordinary. We've barely scratched the surface. For every Göbekli Tepe that archaeologists have excavated, there are dozens more ancient sites still waiting to be discovered. Beneath the waves that drown Doggerland and Sunderland and Beringia, there are settlements and artworks and human stories that may never be recovered. Under the jungles of the Amazon and Southeast Asia, beneath the sands of the Sahara and the Arabian deserts, locked in ice in Antarctica and Greenland, there are secrets that would revolutionize our understanding of human prehistory. Every year brings new discoveries, new DNA analysis revealing previously unknown human species, new dating techniques pushing back the origins of art or seafaring or architecture, new archaeological sites that don't fit our existing models and force us to completely rethink what we thought we knew. Just in the last decade, we've discovered the Denisovans, found evidence of humans in the Americas far earlier than we thought possible, and uncovered stone tools in Algeria that suggest our species is older than we believed. The story keeps changing. The timeline keeps expanding. The forgotten worlds keep revealing themselves. And that's what makes this so exciting. We're not at the end of discovery. We're barely at the beginning. Your generation, the people watching this video right now, you're living through a golden age of archaeological and genetic research. More secrets of human prehistory will be revealed in the next 50 years than in all of previous human history combined. So thank you. Thank you for joining me on this journey through deep time. Thank you for being curious enough to spend hours exploring these forgotten worlds with me. If this exploration sparked something in you, if it made you see yourself and your place in human history differently, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's build a community of history lovers spread across the globe, united by our curiosity about where we came from. And if you really want to support this channel, if you want to help me create more content exploring the mysteries of human prehistory, consider becoming a YouTube member. It's completely optional, never expected, but always deeply appreciated. Every bit of support helps me dedicate more time to research and production. But whether you support or not, whether you subscribe or just pass through, I'm glad you are here. Glad we could take this journey together. Now, as you drift off to sleep, or go about your day, or whatever comes next for you, carry with you this thought. You are the descendant of the toughest, smartest, most adaptable humans who ever lived. Your ancestors survived ice ages and droughts, migrations across impossible distances, encounters with other human species, the rise and fall of civilizations. They painted caves in the darkness and built temples under the stars. They crossed oceans in wooden boats and invented agriculture and metallurgy and writing. They told stories around fires, passing knowledge from generation to generation, across thousands of years, and now those stories have reached you, the whispers of the forgotten worlds, carried across time by an unbroken chain of survival and hope. Sleep well, fellow traveller. The ancestors are with you. They always have been.